Hello, everyone. Happy Monday. Thank you for making this one of the first parts of your week. My name is Katie O'Connor. I am the Director of Policy Development and Programming for the American Constitution Society. And I'd like to start by thanking the Open Society Foundations for hosting us today. Thanks especially to our board member, Julie Fernandez, for helping us secure the space, and to Alla, who worked with us on the logistics. We really do appreciate that. Now, for those of you who are not yet familiar with us, ACS is a nationwide network of lawyers, law students, judges, policymakers, and academics who believe that the law should be a force to improve the lives of all people. ACS works for positive change by shaping debate on critical legal and constitutional questions, such as the ones we'll discuss today. While ACS covers a wide range of issues in its work, we recognize the central importance of voting in our democracy and are more committed than ever to educating and activating our network to protect voting rights. And so on behalf of ACS, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's program, Integrity or Intimidation, Voter Challengers and Election Day Observers. It is such a treat to see so many friends and allies this morning, both in the audience and on the stage. Today, our panelists will discuss the issues and interests surrounding voter challengers and Election Day observers. They'll help us find the line between helpful poll watchers who seek to ensure that all voters have equal access to the ballot and poll watchers whose presence discourages and intimidates voters. We'll hear about the rights and responsibilities of poll watchers to observe the voting process and the corresponding rights of voters to vote free from intimidation. This is always an important topic, but of course, never more so than now, less than 2 months away from a presidential election. Speaking of the presidential election, given the likelihood that our panelists will make reference today to the current campaign and the candidates, I just want to take a minute to remind you that ACS is a nonpartisan organization. We don't endorse or oppose candidates for office, and the opinions of the panelists here today are their own. And now, here to moderate today's discussion is Allegra Chapman, Director of Voting and Elections at Common Cause. Allegra joined Common Cause in July 2014 and leads the organization's efforts to reduce barriers to voting and ensure that elections are run efficiently and fairly throughout the country. Prior to joining Common Cause, Allegra was staff counsel for Demos, where she engaged in litigation and negotiations in several states to enforce Section 7 of the National Voter Registration Act. She also helped to defend the constitutionality of New York's statute eliminating prison-based gerrymandering and worked on other electoral reforms, including Election Day voter registration. Allegra also served as an assistant attorney general in the Civil Rights Bureau for the state of New York, where she brought actions for violations of federal, state, and local civil rights laws on employment discrimination, racial profiling, religious rights infringements, and police matters. Allegra earned her BA from McGill University and her JD from Emory University Law School. Please join me in welcoming Allegra.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you to ACS for pulling this panel together, for OSF for hosting it. It is such a crucial issue, especially now. You know, as you mentioned, the election is less than 2 months away now, and I feel like things are changing on a daily, hourly, by the minute basis, whether it has to do with some of the laws that have been changed. We've seen, a slew of really good court decisions come down recently, in favor of greater voter access, or, just what individuals, political parties, private groups themselves are doing, both to prepare for the election on the ground and sometimes, engaging in behavior that we know has an impact of limiting access to the ballot box. So really excited about today's set of panelists here. I just think it's going to be such a diverse set of views. They each have so many important opinions and insights into this issue, and I think we're going to walk away having a very good idea of what to expect, and also importantly, what can we do in order to ensure that the franchise does stay free, fair, and accessible. So I'm going to give just a real brief rundown of our very accomplished set of panelists here. You can read a bit more about their bios in some of the attached sheets that were presented earlier. They are very accomplished. They've done quite a bit of work when it comes to elections issues. But first to my left is Marcia Johnson-Blanco. She's co-director of the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And, especially important at this time right now, too, is heading up efforts under election protection. And really, we're going to be hearing quite a bit from her about those topics today. To her left is Mark Braden, counsel to Baker and Hostetler. He does quite a bit of work on law affecting the political process, redistricting, other issues, but also once served as chief counsel to the RNC, also to the Ohio Secretary of State in their elections divisions. To his left, and probably very much to his left, although who knows, is Liz Kennedy, who's the Director of Government and Big D Democratic Reform at the Center for American Progress. She has done quite a bit of work on these issues, particularly when it comes to policy and research in order to ensure that voting stays free, fair, and accessible. And then to her left down there is Professor Dan Tokaji, who is a constitutional law professor. Maybe he's very much to her left too. We'll find out. At Moritz College of Law with Ohio State University, and really interested to get his perspective on what is and what isn't going to be permitted for the upcoming election, especially at the polling places. So, Marcia, kick it off for us. What has been going on? I mean, we know that these sorts of issues are not the first of their kind. And that you over at Lawyers Committee have been engaging in this kind of work, election protection work, for quite a while now, I think since 2000, 2002. Yeah, so tell us what you have been seeing over at Lawyers Committee. They do host one of the largest election protection hotlines in the country, and field quite a number of calls across the country leading up to Election Day. What are you seeing? What's the problem? And how can we fix it in 7 minutes or fewer? Just
Well, to start, thanks so much for having me here. It's always great to be a part of ACS's programs. So election protection is the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection program, and the nonpartisan part is very important. And I have been working on election protection since 2004, which was the first presidential election in which we had the election protection program. And from that time, there are certain states that have been figured prominently in what I think is this challenge we face in our elections, because when we think about election integrity, there are two strains. One is ensuring that eligible voters can vote free from intimidation, discrimination, and another is keeping those who are not eligible from the ballot. And where you fall on that scale is when you get into the realm of intimidation. And what we've seen over time is that states have been passing laws that are keeping eligible voters from being able to vote on this very, I would say, shaky foundation of voter fraud that has yet to be proven. And so in 2004, what was my first introduction to what voter intimidation, voter challenges can look like. And it was in Ohio when Ken Blackwell, the Secretary of State, passed a directive about challenging voters and whether you was a precinct-based challenge or a polling place-based challenge, and thousands of voters received letters saying you're going to be challenged, because in Ohio you have to let people know ahead of time whether they would be challenged at the polls, and just seeing what a chilling effect that could have on voters. And over time, we've seen instances of students being challenged in Statesboro, Georgia, because there's always this question or not a question, but a point of view in jurisdictions about where students should vote. Should they vote where they go to school, or should they vote back home? And we've had situations, also when I started Lawyers Committee in 2004, we were dealing with Prairie View, Texas. And Texas is another state where they've been this history of voter challenges. In Prairie View in 2004, the students, the district attorney at the time put a letter in the local paper saying that students were going to be subject to indictment if they voted where they went to school. And now fast forward to today. You may all be aware that Texas has a very restrictive voter ID law. We've been very successful in challenging the law. The court has passed, has required the parties to come up with an interim remedy for the presidential election as the litigation continues, and one that requires that allows those without the restrictive IDs to be able to vote this election. And the parties came up with a settlement that allows voters who don't have one of the restrictive IDs to sign an affidavit saying that they have a reasonable impediment and be able to use other documentation, non-photographic documentation, in order to be able to vote. And both state officials and local officials are saying, you know, voters, we're going to put you on notice that we're really going to scrutinize those affidavits and bring charges against anyone who we think has signed the affidavit improperly. So now both the Civil Rights Council and the DOJ have filed motions with the court to clarify what is acceptable, and in terms of the education of voters and what reasonable impediment really means. And so that those instances of election officials or governmental officials really taking this hard line against voters is really challenging when you have a lack of civic education and voters not really sure about what do I need in order to be able to vote. And that helps to influence this climate of voter intimidation. What I'll say lastly is that the issue of voters being unsure about what they need to vote, voting rules changing all the time, leads to another blend of what I would call voter intimidation, which is deceptive practices. So we've seen instances where voters have received robocalls or flyers telling them if they, particularly in presidential elections, if they voted already this year, then they're not allowed to vote in November. Or if you owe traffic tickets or owe any debt to the state, then you're not able to vote. Or when there's lots of voter interest, there's going to be a lot of turnout. So one party votes on Tuesday and one party is going to vote on Wednesday in order to alleviate lines. So we've seen this deceptive practices layered on top of laws that have been passed primarily since 2010 that makes it harder for eligible voters to be able to vote. So with election protection this year, what we did in 2012 and in 2016 is that we are reaching out now to election officials, particularly where you have candidates saying, we're going to send people out to watch you, to say you need to ensure that eligible voters are able to vote and have plans in place to be able to do that. So I'll stop there and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, that was really helpful. Dan, just picking up on that thread, love to hear from you about what crosses the line. You know, what is permitted under the First Amendment, what crosses into intimidating behavior, and what are courts doing about it?
So, first of all, thanks to ACS and especially Katie for putting this together, who reminded me to turn on my microphone, and to Open Society for hosting us. So what's permitted and what crosses the line? Let me start with just a bit of background, right? So every state has its own rules about what's permissible and what's not, including what's permissible around polling places. In addition, there is federal law on the books. Actually, there are 3 federal statutes, one of them a part of the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 that's still on the books, one a part of the Voting Rights Act of 1957, and then Section 11B of the Voting Rights Act that, broadly speaking, prohibit voter intimidation. Right? Now, there is, I think, sometimes a line-drawing issue, right? And in some contexts, at least, there are some important First Amendment rights at stake. So, broadly speaking, there's a line between what goes on inside the polling place, right, where the right to vote predominates and where the government can restrict what goes on inside the polling place. There's actually a Supreme Court case on this, Burson versus Freeman, which says that the interests in both preventing voter intimidation and promoting electoral integrity justify some restrictions on free speech rights. And it's actually not just within the polling place itself, but in that case at least, involving a Tennessee statute, 100 feet outside the polling place, right? The court said it was okay for the state to restrict electioneering activities and other sorts of campaign-related speech, even though this is a content-based restriction that was subject to strict scrutiny. Now, when you get further outside this zone, I think it becomes difficult, at least there would be a more skeptical view of various activities that are sometimes referred to as voter intimidation. Not necessarily all, but at least some of them. Let me just give one example, right? The term voter intimidation is actually used, I think, in a lot of different ways, and sometimes not always that precisely. When I use this term, I'm using it to refer to various activities that are designed to suppress the vote. And I'm not talking about laws like voter ID laws, which I put in a separate category, which many people believe are sometimes intended to keep people from voting. I'm talking about, people who are sometimes private actors, maybe sometimes public actors, but usually private actors, operating in a way that is designed to keep people from voting. So you'll sometimes hear complaints about billboards, right, in minority neighborhoods. Right? There was one in Ohio a few years ago which says if you commit voter fraud, you can be sent to prison for 3 years, right? And apparently this billboard was mostly put up in African-American neighborhoods. Now, I don't like this billboard. I think it could plausibly be deemed a kind of voter intimidation, but I also think that that is protected speech under the First Amendment of the Constitution. I haven't completely answered the question. I do think you get into some challenges even within the polling place, and Mark may be intending to talk about this in his remarks, so I'm just going to address it briefly, and we can talk more about it later, perhaps. But what's the line between observation on the one hand, which is not only permissible, but I would say necessary to ensure the integrity of elections, and intimidation, right? In some cases, the line may be clear. Somebody's, let's say you've got a polling observer affiliated with one of the parties who's calling attention to a broken voting machine. In others, the line may be less clear. So you've got an observer who's continually whispering to one of the poll workers, I don't think this person is eligible, I don't think this person is eligible, right? And we get into more challenging questions in that kind of context. Let me just say one final thing. I have to say I've been somewhat skeptical, generally speaking, about whether this is the kind of problem that's likely to be a difference maker, right? Voter registration issues, I mean, these are practices that affect tens of thousands, sometimes even 100,000s of voters. Those can affect a lot of people. Voter ID too, maybe early voting restrictions. I've been a bit more skeptical, I guess, about whether these are likely to change who wins elections for a couple of reasons. One, I'm not sure how many people are actually affected by these. Right? Election protection has done some good work, as has Liz, about what's actually going on out there. But necessarily, a lot of this evidence is anecdotal. Right? The other question, especially in this election, is how big is the margin of victory going to be, right? And I guess in contrast to a lot of people, I've thought all along that this could very well be a close election, which is what's making me somewhat more concerned about the possibility, especially given one of the presidential candidates' discussions of election rigging and urging people to do something about it. And I guess my concern is really not so much about what happens in heavily African American precincts or heavily Latino precincts. I don't think that many people in those precincts are likely to feel intimidated. I think it's more likely to be in the predominantly white, Republican, maybe rural precincts where you've got some minority voters, but a majority who are not and who may well be Trump supporters, where people may feel some trepidation about going out to the polls on Election Day. And that turns out to be an incredibly difficult thing to measure, right? How many people are affected by this sort of, you might call it soft intimidation. It's not like the old days where, somebody's standing in front of the polling place or the registrar's office with a club, right? But there may be some concern that if I go to the polls because of the color of my skin, because of the way that I'm dressed and the way that I look, I might get challenged when somebody else won't be.
Thanks, Dan. That's really helpful. And I hope we return to this discussion after our other two panelists make some introductory remarks. I'm interested in hearing more about this issue of soft intimidation. And Marcia, you may have something to say about, the case of that billboard in Ohio or Wisconsin in a predominantly African American community. Is that really, is the intent there to intimidate? And if so, what then? Is it permitted or not? Or regardless of whether something is constitutionally permitted or not, what is the practice that we should be aiming to achieve? Really looking forward to more of this discussion. So now I'm going to go to Liz. And Liz, I think a couple years ago, co-authored a Bullies at the Ballot Box report, which she will give us some insights on, covering what the states are or aren't doing when it comes to challenger laws at the polls. So let us know, what are the states doing?
Sure. I think first, obviously really glad that ACS. Yes. Good thing we all thank Katie first so she can tell us to put our microphone on. It's good practice. But I think that this is such an important conversation to be having. So thank you. And these issues really need to be raised. And I think we really do need to pay attention to what is happening now and then what might be coming down the pike in a few short weeks. So thank you to OSF for providing the space. To Dan's point about whether, how much this happens and whether it really would be outcome determinative or what have you, I am of the strong opinion that election integrity really means whether every eligible American is able to cast a ballot that is counted, and now we get to add the phrase, whether it's counted properly. So I think that the right to vote is a personal right. Every individual American citizen, it is one of our most fundamentally important rights, famously protective of all other rights. And so even if this were merely a question, to a certain extent, of being uniformly distributed and only on the margins, even then I would say we, and particularly as lawyers or voting rights lawyers, should be, or concerned citizens, should really strive to orient our legal systems to be as protective of voting rights for every eligible American to be able to cast a ballot that is counted. Unfortunately, this is something that affects, and this just very narrowly as defined as voters having their right to vote challenged, whether on election day or in pre-election day challenges, has affected thousands, probably to the extent of tens of thousands of voters. And we also know that these challenges are very much not uniformly just distributed throughout the population, but rather are very much targeted on communities of color. People of color are having their voting rights burdened by these really unnecessary challenges to their voting rights. And I think, I hope everyone in this room saw the article in August from the New York Times about the practice in the state of Georgia, where, and I will just read a quote from this, I'm going to bring in a few examples of what we have actually seen on the ground in the past few election cycles, which perhaps these are to a certain extent anecdotal, but I would say that this is also the kind of question where this represents perhaps a tip of an iceberg that we don't necessarily know where all of these other issues may arise in the 8,000 distributed local jurisdictions throughout this country. But we know of a few, and they are very concerning. So this year in Georgia, the majority white Hancock County Board of Elections and Registration was systematically questioning the registrations of more than 180 Black Sparta citizens, a fifth of the city's registered voters, by dispatching deputies with summonses commanding them to appear in person to prove their residence or lose their voting rights. I mean, if that doesn't strike you as something that people were sitting in, marching, and dying about in the 50s and 60s, I think those echoes are self-evident. In 2012, reports that activists challenged the registrations of over 2,000 Ohio voters, especially students and African Americans, and these challenges proved baseless. Also in 2012, activists in Wisconsin, quote, streamed in to poor Black and Latino precincts around Racine, hunting for evidence that people were cheating. An official investigation yielded no evidence of fraud, but many reports of voter intimidation. There were also reported sightings of poll watchers tailing vans that were transporting voters to the polls, snapping photos of voters' license plates, and even directing voters to the wrong polling places, the kind of deceptive practices that Marcia spoke about. We all know, and this will transition me into then the report we did about the laws, looking to this, in 2010, activists in Harris County, Texas, filed 56 complaints, or rather, sorry, other activists, they're activists on both sides, but there were 56 complaints filed against other activists who were hovering near voters, getting into election workers' faces, and blocking and disrupting lines of voters in predominantly African American and Hispanic precincts during the early voting periods. Those reports prompted investigations from the county attorney's office as well as the U.S. Department of Justice. And that was also famously in some circles, seen as the first set of activities from a group that is now known as True the Vote, a Tea Party affiliated organization that in 2012 threatened / promised to send over 1 million poll watchers to precincts and polling stations, and their professed goal was to make the experience of voting like driving and seeing the police following you, which is, it's chilling both in kind of the like, that's so chilling, but it is also really a question of chilling constitutionally protected activities. No one, I would posit, likes driving and seeing the police following them, and certainly that seems to ascribe a certain assumption of a law-breaking mentality to our fellow American citizens seeking to exercise their constitutionally protected rights. So I was at Demos at the time, and we worked with Common Cause to put together this report, Bullies at the Ballot Box, Protecting the Freedom to Vote Against Wrongful Challenges and Intimidation, which goes through the laws on 4 measures to see how well state laws were set up to protect voters and how easily they might be open for behavior that instead would chill or overly burden voting rights. So we looked at the process for challenging a registrar's right to vote before Election Day and the use of voter caging lists. We looked at the process for challenging a registered voter's right on Election Day, the behavior of poll watchers and observers at the polls, and then protections for voters against intimidation outside and inside the polls. And I'll just, looking at the Election Day challenges that we've seen, just comparing a couple of states to give you kind of the micro level view of what the laws do and don't allow. So in Colorado, for example, and this is for people that are on Election Day or presumably also sometimes during early voting, but in the act of voting, their right to vote can be challenged. Grounds for challenging whether someone is a citizen or whether they are of age or a resident or have met residency restrictions. So the good news about just taking one state, the challenges must be made in writing and under oath and signed by the challenger under penalty of perjury and must contain a specific factual basis for that challenge. So those are all very protective. Like if someone is going to make a voter challenge that's not just, willy-nilly. These are some procedural safe grounds. And we found that another protective feature of the Colorado law is that a challenged voter can vote a regular ballot after signing an affidavit affirming their actual eligibility. So Colorado, satisfactory, good set of laws. In, however, Florida, they had a couple of good provisions in that only electors from the same county may challenge, right, as opposed to maybe any voter in the state or anyone who's in the polling location. And there are penalties for filing a frivolous charge, but it is very problematic. In Florida, all challenged voters are required to vote provisionally. So as soon as somebody is challenged, they then have to vote provisionally and have to provide evidence to meet the challenge within 2 days going to the polls. And so we could read these tables or these charts of all of the various states, but those are just some of the different ways that these laws either are or aren't protective of voters. But I do think, and I'm sure that we will go back here, what we are actually seeing is can be really targeted efforts. So one example I hadn't reported out, in Washington state in 2004, a man challenged the voting credentials of hundreds of voters claiming they were illegal immigrants. He had made his list by looking for names that appeared foreign, but eliminating names that, quote, clearly sounded American-born, like John Smith or Powell. So I think that we can't forget when we're looking into the minutia of what the actual legal framework is, which I assure you we could talk about. It's written down here. We'll be coming out with a little bit of an update for specific places, that this really is a question of, in this environment of racially charged rhetoric where candidates are saying the only way they can lose is if there's cheating going on, that may very well encourage some of this very problematic behavior that has real-world consequences, very much for the individuals who are losing their rights to votes, for the communities that no longer have that representation, and for our nation as a whole, vis-a-vis our decision-making for the future and the kind of political polity we want to be.
Thanks, Liz. So we've heard about soft intimidation. We've heard about harder intimidation. We're seeing some of this behavior come from individuals and private groups like True the Vote. And then there are also allegations of political parties engaging in this kind of work. So, Mark, you have been chief counsel to the Republican National Committee, I think, for 10 years and have also been an elections advisor to other government officials. What's going on? What do political parties engage in, if anything? And how would you be advising your clients?
Well, first of all, I start out with the proposition that our system works very well. Our election system on the whole works very well, but it doesn't work perfect. And there are problems. There are problems with intimidation. There are problems with vote fraud. Don't fool yourself that the votes are always counted accurately, and don't fool yourself that people who are not eligible to vote don't regularly vote in this country. They do. And the facts of that are straightforward. I've seen them personally. I've seen them in the context of recounts, in some cases very large numbers of illegal voters or votes that were counted illegally. That said, the process here is dependent in this country on the participation principally of volunteers or people who are effectively volunteers. There are two groups in the polling places. There's the poll workers who, although not volunteers, are pretty damn close to being volunteers. And anybody looking around here who's been a poll worker knows that's sort of minimum wage for a 12-and-a-half-hour day. This is not a lifetime experience in most cases being an election worker. So these people are not volunteers, are employed by the state or the county clerk, not the state really, the county clerks, because almost all our system is county-based. So you've got those people, dedicated people doing that, and you have the poll watchers, dedicated people from the party. The party's role is in both of these processes. In almost all the states, the poll workers are supposed to be party people from the different parties. Our system isn't based upon a government watching itself. Our system of integrity in the election process is opposing parties watching each other, both in the actual election officials in the polling places and in the poll watchers. The problems in our system really arise in two areas. A different subject to talk about postal voting, and that's a different subject for a different day. But the significant problems arise in our system for minorities. When I say minorities, though, I'm talking about minorities in the context of a particular geographic location. That minority might be black, might be Asian, it might be white, it might be Republican. In those areas where there are not poll workers and poll watchers of opposing parties, then you're dependent upon truth, justice of the individual person, and sometimes that doesn't exist. I guess as a conservative, I believe in original sin, and when both sides aren't watching the other, you have bad processes. Poll workers and poll watchers are vital to the integrity of the system. People participating is very important. But the fundamentally most important thing of any election system has two pieces. One, the person who got the most legitimate votes wins the office. And two, the reasonable supporters of the person who lost believe that their candidates lost the election. And for that to be the case, you need poll workers from both parties and precincts around the country. That's very difficult in some areas. Very difficult in some Democratic areas for Republicans to get in. Who gets intimidated in polling places? Let's be clear. Who gets intimidated in polling places are those folks who are in the minority. Sometimes that's a racial minority, but often that's a political minority. The notion that poll workers shouldn't have an active role is then an invitation to intimidation. And intimidation at a very much more direct stage. Anyone here who's actually worked as a poll worker, I don't know how many have, most certainly have seen examples of people wanting to help people vote. Now, that's permissible under state law, absolutely, depending upon the very specific provisions of state law. But of course, if there's no one watching the process, and there's only one party present or one group present, that process of helping people sometimes becomes, shall we say, somewhat more aggressive. And that's a very big problem. And it's a problem that's not above the covers if there's only one group in the polling place. So the parties, both Democrat and Republicans, play this vital role. Some of the most debilitating things for our system are the state laws that won't let you appoint people from outside the precinct to be poll workers or poll watchers. People talk to me, and I always use one example, then I'll stop. And somebody actually, I used this example in an interview, and then some reporter called me up and said, "You're a liar." Literally said, "You're a liar." I said, "Well, here, go back and look at this." I was in Chicago doing the recount of the governor's race in 1982. was another century, but not that far in the past. So I go into the Board of Elections, and the chairman of the Board of Elections there, and the political reporter for Sun-Times or the Chicago Tribune is there, and they're saying, well, you're a paranoid Republican. This vote fraud stuff we don't have that anymore, and you're just a fool, blah, blah. And I'm going, well, what the hell do I know? I've been in Illinois before. I know nothing about it. I mean, I've heard all the stories, but I know nothing about it. We're going to recount the votes. That Stevenson lost the election on election night. We're going to recount the votes. So we recounted the votes. Not my report. This is the grand jury report. On election night, 10%. That's 110,000 votes on election night in Chicago in that election were made up by the poll workers. And they were made up by the poll workers because even though Illinois law permitted the appointment of a Republican poll worker, there was no Republican Party to appoint a poll worker. So all the poll workers in those 10% of the precincts were Democrats. And the Democratic machine had decided what the result was going to be in each of the polling places. So if you think for a moment that people steal cars, people steal money, why you would think they wouldn't steal votes if it's available to them. And it's available to them if there aren't people from the other side, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat on the other side watching the process. People will do what people will do.
So just to push back just for a second there, and then I want to open it up to really anyone who wants to jump in here and let's just engage in a little more dialogue. I think it's an interesting point about both parties needing to be present in polling places, I guess, in order to check each other. And yet at the same time, poll workers, when they're working as poll workers, and ensuring that the election is, running according to the law, are acting as agents of the state itself. The state has an interest in ensuring that the election is run fairly, that it's run according to state law. And so those poll workers, it's important. I think the point is that it's important to just not to take this out of the parties, because it's not just a party versus party issue. It's really, how is the state going to ensure that people have the right to vote? I think that's why we have a lot of these laws on the books. And, just curious to open it up to really anyone on the panel here as to, well, Marcia, maybe, if what have you been hearing from the hotline when people do call in? Like, are people calling in saying, I feel as though, I'm being intimidated because I'm a Republican or a Democrat, or is it usually along other lines? And how's the state ensuring, at the polling place that the rules are followed fairly?
Right. So to start, if we're talking about poll workers, I think particularly when there's a narrative of someone is going to steal the votes, and there are these confusing election laws about which voter ID applies, and confusion about assistance at the polling place, there's a lot of power that's put in the hands of the poll workers. They're the gateway, they have the gateway to being able to vote. And so it's very important that they be properly trained. So when someone, as we got a call, for example, Arizona in 2012, where there was a poll watcher in a polling place who was questioning the eligibility of voters over the objection of the poll workers, and videotaping voters for evidence. And the voters complained to our election protection volunteer, and the volunteer went in. Now, our volunteers are nonpartisan. We're not party poll watchers, so we can just go in to have a brief dialogue with the poll workers, but I can't stay in the polling places in most states. And the poll worker said to our volunteer, I know there's a problem, but you can't stay here, you have to leave. And we actually had to work with the Secretary of State to get someone in there to address this problem, and it took hours and hours, and many voters were affected. So I definitely agree with Liz about this being an individual. I think we all agree that it's individuals. It's on an individual level that intimidation has an impact. So while it may not affect the outcome marginally or the percentage of an election, individuals are being intimidated. And we have found through litigation, Liz mentioned Hancock County, which the Lawyers Committee is suing and challenging and getting voters back on the rolls. These are an individual right that's being affected. And it does have a chilling effect when there are groups like True to Vote who said, we're going to have 1 million poll watchers there to watch you and make sure that you can vote. And then I have a quote here, I think from the True to Vote National Summit, when you have this rhetoric of Tom Fritton from Judicial Watch in 2012 saying that there was concern that Obama's people want to be able to steal the election in 2012 with illegal alien vote and food stamp army. I mean, there are particular voters who these challenges are against. And when you don't have laws like Colorado that say you need specific evidence that this person may not be eligible, but I can just challenge someone on the way they look, the fact that they need language assistance at the polls, then that's when things become problematic.
Dan.
Let me just respond to a couple of things that Mark said in his remarks. There was actually quite a bit in what he said that I agreed with. First of all, I think it's absolutely true that it is political minorities within a particular precinct or particular jurisdiction with respect to whom we should be most concerned about this set of problems that we're talking about today, right? This could be, for example, in a predominantly white, rural, Republican county or precinct in Colorado, intimidation, whether hard or soft, of Latinos. It could also, at least conceivably, be of Republican voters in urban areas that tend to be very heavily Democratic. It's also true that sometimes fraud does happen, but if you look back historically, it's most often some sort of insider fraud, like ballot stuffing or something along those lines that's occurred. And this is why it is really important, as Mark said, that the parties be able to keep an eye on each other. In my state, we do this through having an equal number of people from each party working as poll workers. So it's most often some sort of insider fraud if there's fraud, and then if there is voter fraud, it's most often with absentee ballots, although that's pretty rare. You don't very often. In fact, it's quite uncommon, as the Third Circuit noted in its opinion, keeping in place this consent decree that exists against the DNC a few years ago. It's quite uncommon that you actually have voter fraud at the polling place. Now, you do sometimes, again, not frequently, but sometimes you have people who are disenfranchised felons who don't realize they're disenfranchised and mistakenly vote. I think you occasionally have non-citizens, although there's actually some research on this. The extent to which that exists is often vastly overstated. Last point here. I mentioned earlier this section of the Voting Rights Act which prohibits voter intimidation. Right? So I went on the Department of Justice website last night to look at their cases, at least cases from recent years, involving this statute, Section 11B of the Voting Rights Act. And guess how many cases I found that the Department of Justice had brought? Yeah, well, I told you that earlier, Jerry, so you knew. And guess what? Guess what? Well, yeah, he did name them. I've helped prodded him a little bit. One of them is the Ike Brown case out of this small county in Mississippi involving discrimination against white voters by the dominant African-American faction. And the other is the new Black Panther Party case. You may remember this from 2008 involving these two gentlemen who were standing in front, and it got a lot of attention. At least if you watch Fox News, you would have been very aware of this. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't mean for a moment to defend what those two gentlemen in particular were doing, but I really have trouble believing that these two cases are representative of the problem of voter intimidation in the country, and think it would be beneficial if either the government or private actors, there is a private right of action to enforce this statute, although it's rarely used, would it would at least, I think it would be helpful if voting rights groups would consider this as a potential tool. Let me leave it at that.
That's really helpful, and I'm glad you brought up, this will be the first time in, 50 plus years that we're not going to have representatives from the Department of Justice in a number of states that were once covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And so, in some states that were previously being, protected by the federal government, that was ensuring that everything was going on according to how it should be, there are going to be gaps now. And given that we have seen, I think, a lot of sort of like political gearing up for some groups or supporters to be going out to the polling place, I think it makes sense for people to be on guard. Just going to, well, really, it's like, what's it all about? Why is all of this fear mongering going on in the first place, right? I mean, this issue about voter fraud, elections integrity, what's really at stake. I mean, again, going back to the DOJ, when the DOJ under the Bush administration, George W. Bush, was prosecuting quote unquote voter fraud, I think the percentage of cases that actually, the percentage of cases being prosecuted as opposed to the number of people who are voting, it was something like 5 zeros, then 2-3, to represent the percentage of voter fraud that actually occurs in this country. Never mind that every state already has on its books, too, laws prohibiting this kind of behavior that states do and should use in instances when this happens. So, why have this kind of extra effort, especially if it's led by political parties, to ensure that this vote stays safe when we really do already have these mechanisms in place already. So, I mean, Liz, what's it all about? What's really at stake here? And how do we go about kind of separating out these fears, whether they're grounded or not, and these other accessibility issues, and making sure that people are going to the polling place and are not feeling intimidated when they cast their ballot?
Well, those are a whole set of great questions.
Any one of them.
Sure. I mean, I think just to revisit some of what we were opening with, that while no voter should feel that their voting rights are burdened or that they are the subject of intimidation or attempts at suppression, again, in every reported instance that I have seen, with the acceptance of that one new Black Panther Party case, or I don't know about the Ike case, Jerry Brown can explain it, but really the question here is that these are tools to target and suppress communities of color, particularly now and since 2008, when we've seen growing political participation and just the general demographic change that we are facing as a country. So I think everyone is well aware that our country will be majority people of color by, the year keeps changing, last I heard was 2046. So that's not that long ago. I think we all know that there has been, I'm sorry, not that long from now. We also, I think, have to, think about the economic dislocation and perhaps even the cultural dislocation that we are seeing on behalf of some white communities where, not to broaden this beyond the confines of this discussion, but where, global economic trends have not been friends at all to the, formerly ascendant white working class, and that there is real pain, and we need real representation, and we need real solutions to rebalance the interests in our democracy so that everyone's voices are being heard and that government is working for all and not just wealthy special interests. But the place to have that fight is not at the ballot box where people try to increase their own representation, or, of course, in redistricting, where people try to increase their own representation at a cost to another individual American's right to have their voice heard at the polls. I think, we have to surface the fact that voter challenger laws themselves, as opposed to poll watcher questions, which is another question, I'll put that aside for a second. Voter challenger laws themselves absolutely have a racially discriminatory history in our country. They were passed in Virginia, in Florida, in Ohio, in Texas, as part of Reconstruction amendments or in the immediate wake, I suppose, of Reconstruction, as efforts to keep newly enfranchised African Americans from, and I suppose in Texas, the Latino community, from being able to exercise their political power at the polls. There's just no real question. These were part of the suppressive measures tied into packages with poll taxes and literacy tests aimed at recently freed slaves. And in this instance, it was the Democratic Party, right, who was doing this suppression. There's a report in 1896 that Democrats had sent out challengers and every colored man's vote was contested in one Richmond ward in Virginia. So I think, in Ohio, the actual language in the 19th century law was it required election judges to challenge any prospective voter who had, quote, a distinct and visible admixture of African blood. So the point is that these are laws that were put in place to allow for challenges, but more specifically challenges of community of color. I think that we are seeing a renewal of those efforts in some places because of the political power that they offer to people who want to maintain their own political power through any number of ways. Wasn't it a legislator in North Carolina who said, well, if African Americans were voting Republican, then you wouldn't see this kind of law? I think there's just been admissions across the board from a variety. Pennsylvania legislators saying, voter ID is going to win the state for Romney in 2012. So I think we, as the circuit courts have been doing, should call a spade when they say in North Carolina that the Republican legislatures were targeting with almost surgical precision the African American vote when they designed their monster voter suppression law. In Texas, the district court judge held that their voter ID provisions was akin to a poll tax and intentionally racially discriminatory. That poll tax finding was overturned by the circuit court and sent back to revisit the finding of intentional racial discrimination, but the circuit court found that there was enough evidence there to support that. So the courts are finding that the states are using intentionally racially discriminatory measures to really to burden voting rights, presumably to affect the outcomes of elections. And we're seeing that that candidates are suggesting that they can only lose if there's cheating. And I think that you made an excellent point, Mark, that we really need to think about not just the actual integrity of the election, but then how to communicate to perhaps the supporters of a losing candidate to maintain, above all, the peaceful transfer of power in our great constitutional democracy. And I think that's a question that we're going to need to really examine going forward. Hopefully not too much. Hopefully it won't be a problem. But those are, where are the channels to say our elections, as you say, are generally very well run? I think ideally they should be run in a nonpartisan election administration way. I think that should be the highest order of running elections in our country. Wisconsin used to have the General Accountability Board before it was dismantled. We should move back towards that. So there are really reforms that we can take, but I think until we move away from this posture of just a voting wars and having voting rights and access caught up in these kind of larger racial representation frames. And I mean, maybe that's pie in the sky because our country for hundreds of years has in fact been dealing with all of those issues. Just one note, in researching for this, there was an election, there was a state where all women's votes were challenged after the 19th Amendment was passed in one polling location. So it just depends on, I suppose, whose new voices folks are seeking to exclude.
A lot of good.
What?
Where in the world did that happen?
I will go back to my notes and get back to you.
Does anyone want to respond to Liz?
Let me real quickly, and the voting wars have been very good to us in private practice, so I'm not sure but leaving aside that little, we can spend a lot of time talking about the existing voting war and all the litigation as to whether early voting and changing early voting, by changing any of the early voting rules, somehow that's now racially discriminatory, or trying to draw an election plan that's pro-Democrat, which was what was on the legislature perceived as pro-Democrat, and then to change those rules and perceive it to be pro-Republican, and that then becomes racial discrimination. The district court judge there came to a different conclusion. The circuit court judges basically decided that North Carolina was discriminatory because they decided to discriminate against Democrats, rightly or wrongly, everybody agree with that, and because the majority of Democratic voters in North Carolina were black, that meant it was racially discriminatory. Kind of a strange view of the Voting Rights Act, when in fact the Voting Rights Act had more support from the Republican Party traditionally across the board than the Democratic Party. But leaving that aside, voter intimidation, there are the issues we talk about. The more difficult issues are the ones that are much more difficult to address, both in the quantity and in addressing. Most voter intimidation, if you're just anyone who's been to polling places or traveled around the country, actually observed polling places around the country, knows that most voter intimidation, in the sense of numbers, occurs in the context of unwanted assistance in the process. People showing up and wanting to vote, and then people deciding they're going to help them vote. And that's a very common but difficult to quantify and difficult to deal with across the country. And so that happens all the time. The other context of voter intimidation occurs in the context of an issue that's sort of outside this, which is in the realm of postal voting and mail voting. That process, in fact, does away with the traditional protections of the Australian ballot that were adopted for an obvious reason, which was the old process where you didn't have a secret ballot, people were intimidated. Voting by mail gets rid of the secret ballot. Again, I happen to believe when you open up the opportunity, some people will use that opportunity, especially when you have a political process as polarized as us, where you believe the other side is the Antichrist, so defeating them for any reason is important. Although, frankly, most of the vote fraud and intimidation isn't really about voting for Barack Obama versus Romney. It's really voting upon, okay, are we going to pass this Indian gaming initiative? Or who's going to be the local city councilman? Or those types of issues which drive real economic concerns of individuals. Who's going to be the county sheriff? If you want to know races where people steal votes, check out some county sheriff's elections around this country, or probate judge elections around this country, where the people counting the votes, their job is dependent upon who wins. And if somebody from the other side isn't watching the process. So those are more difficult. I know they don't, the notion of saying, well, how do we deal with undue assistance is difficult, and it's a sporadic type thing around this country, but go to polling places. And I would suggest to you that in half the polling places in the United States, at some given moment, somebody is being illegally assisted on their vote. Now, that's because it's a complicated process, people think, and somebody asked to do it, and they say, well, I'll be happy to do it because they asked to do it. In some states, that would be okay. In some states, it wouldn't be okay. In some states, people when they get asked, oh, can I help you, are always going to say yes because they know that's supposed to be the right answer. So those are concerns. If anybody in this room's got a suggestion how to deal with those, please give them, because that dwarfs all the rest of the discussion we've had.
Wow. Okay. Well, looks like everyone has a suggestion. But Dan, I want to take it to you, and then Marcia, Liz, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience.
So let me just say two quick things. First, it's not exactly what the Fourth Circuit said in the NAACP case, in which the court found that North Carolina had intentionally discriminated on the basis of race by adopting all of these voting restrictions. It is true, as he noted, that the ultimate goal of the North Carolina legislature was to help Republicans win elections by making it more difficult for Democrats to vote. Right. Now, that in itself isn't a violation of the Voting Rights Act or the Constitution, but when you accomplish that ultimate end by making it more difficult for blacks to vote, that is in fact a violation of both of those laws. And in this case, the evidence showed that the state legislature, the Republican-dominated state legislature, had actually asked for racial data on the people and how the various changes like restrictions on early voting and voter ID and same-day registration would affect African American as opposed to white voters. And there's a reason they did this, because guess what? In North Carolina and a number of other states, whether you are African American is a better predictor of how you will vote than your actual party affiliation. So, second point, let me agree with him on one thing, right? What happens at the polling place is something that we often don't pay a lot of attention to, at least before elections, but is really important. And so if you're listening to this thinking, well, what can we do about this? You know, one of the things we can make sure we do is to try to get as many people to volunteer, good, thoughtful people. It's always nice, by the way, if they're lawyers, because, you can have some understanding of the law, who are, which many poll workers, don't, and it's hard to blame them too, because, they're doing their public service for a day. But it's a good thing to have intelligent people at the polls, and making sure that the training, including the training about what's permissible and what's not, when it comes to challenging voters. This training is really important, and so getting in touch with local election authorities about that is something that can be done. And sometimes I worry, we pay a lot of attention to things when they go wrong, whether it's, voting machines or long lines at the polling place, or the sorts of issues regarding voting intimidation that we're talking about today. But the real thinking has to get done, like right now, if not yesterday, about, are there adequate preparations being made to prevent these sorts of problems from occurring in the first place?
Definitely. I just want to pick up on that point about training and ensuring that elections officials are adequately trained, right? Especially going to the point you made earlier, Marcia, about Texas, and how just when you think you've got an agreement in place, it seems like people are starting to upend it. So in places like Texas and in other states where we've seen recent changes, it's going to be really crucial that there is adequate training. Okay, lightning round, because then we definitely want to get to questions from the audience. 2 minutes.
Okay, starting with Liz.
Go ahead, Marcia.
Okay,
Yeah.
So really quickly, regarding assistance, in my experience, what we found are people are denied their assistance of choice at polling places. Not that they're getting improper assistance, but that minorities, particularly those with limited English proficiency, are not being allowed their assistance of choice at polling places, or even those with disabilities not being allowed their assistance of choice, not that they're being forced by others to vote in any particular way. I do also want to address that, this hiding behind a partisan justification for passing discriminatory laws is problematic. Yes, minorities vote predominantly for a particular party, and so it's easy to say, well, it's not the minorities we're after but the party. But when you go after the party in this way, you are having a disproportional impact on minority voters. And for example, early voting in Ohio, We did a study in 2012, Cuyahoga County, which found that African Americans vote 25 times more than whites during early voting. I was very struck by such an awesome finding, but minorities do take advantage of early voting opportunities disproportionately. And then lastly, another case that DOJ did bring that ended in a consent decree that I wanted to mention was in Hamtramck, Michigan, where in an election in the late 90s, Arab Americans were asked by poll workers to take a citizenship oath before voting, and that ended in a consent decree. So DOJ, one more on the DOJ column there.
Well, we're in total agreement on the notion that, when I was talking about improper assistance, one of the biggest problems with improper assistance is, oh, you can't bring your husband in to help you because you don't read English. You've got to use one of the poll workers. So that most certainly the concern about improper assistance, absolutely in the context of most states will permit people to bring or designate or ask certain people to do it. But of course, there are places where the poll workers decide that they're the only ones who can do it to be sure that you vote, in fact, the right way. So that's absolutely. North Carolina, I'm not doing the litigation, but let me assure you that there are 2 points of view. There's a 250-page opinion from the district court judge who has an absolutely different view of that, what was passed. And then early voting. The data is pretty clear on early voting. It has no impact, none, zero, on actual voter turnout. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but that's what the data basically shows. There's been a lot of studies on it. Is there a differential usage in Ohio in a couple of the elections? And the answer to that is absolutely right. But it doesn't appear, I'm sort of an agnostic on early voting, although people, I will have to tell you, as is often the case in this area, and a whole lot of things that will offend everybody on every side, I'll be happy to say in regards to voter ID and early voting. Early voting has no discernible partisan effect. It has no truly discernible effect on turnout. Those are counterintuitive and what people don't like to hear, and a lot of people spending a lot of money on this litigation, but it hasn't had the effects that people think it has. The fact that there's a differential turnout, the reality, of course, is with early voters are that they are overwhelmingly the most dedicated voters who show up, whether you have an early voting or don't have early voting.
And yet, on that point, I mean, and then to circle back to a few others, early voting
Your mic.
is it not? Early voting absolutely increases the just flexibility and convenience and access for, as Marcia said, any number of voters, but particularly for voters of color. And so, and as well as I think, one of the other problems that we've seen at the polls is the long lines that, again, don't fall equally between precincts, but rather, in larger communities of color, you can see lines of over an hour waiting to vote, 4 and 5 hours at times, or even longer. That in itself is burdening someone's voting rights if you're asking them to wait online for 4 or 5 hours. We don't see election administration run uniformly with the number of polling places or the number of actual polling stations, adequately distributed between white communities and communities of color. I did want to pick up on one other thing that was said, and particularly I'm glad that we noted that really the larger problem with assistance is people not getting assistance to which they are legally entitled, particularly, for example, voters with disabilities who are entitled to curbside voting, and yet that is not something that they're allowed to do actually at the polls. With nursing homes, you see horrible examples of people of goodwill in Georgia trying to help voters return absentee ballots and being prosecuted for felonies. Not at all changing an outcome of a vote, but just procedural errors, and that's the kind of thing that makes it more difficult. It makes people less willing to engage in our democratic process. We should remember, we have one of the lowest voter turnout rates in the industrialized world. So when we are making it more difficult for Americans to vote, we are doing a huge disservice to our country and our future when fewer and fewer voters have their voices heard and therefore represented in government. Sorry, that's not going to get us to 2 minutes, right? But I will just end by saying when we're talking about the votes for the elections for county sheriff, I think, Dan, you may have misspoken just technically earlier when you mentioned a consent decree for the DNC. I believe that it is the RNC that is still under a consent decree
Right.
The DNC
They
was
were
the
both
plaintiff,
parties.
The RNC was the defendant. Sorry if I misspoke.
through 2017, and that is because of sending law enforcement to the polls, which of course, is a traditional voter intimidation tactic. Even if you aren't challenging voters, people who are maybe, I don't know, late on child support are perhaps going to turn around and not go towards law enforcement. I don't think we need to talk about the relationships between law enforcement and communities of color right now in this country. And so the idea that that some candidates are calling upon law enforcement, we have to have sheriffs and the police chiefs and everybody watching in this election is chilling and perhaps even violates this RNC consent decree. But so that's, I think, what we need to be thinking about and working to protect every vote.
All right. And with that, who's got a question? Just a couple. All right. I think there's a mic circulating.
Gonna hold it, okay. Since Mark, you doubled down on
Well, I've been
wait a
designated
minute.
victim in the panel.
You doubled down on the early voting issue. So you're saying you maintain your argument in the face of Ohio as well as Florida, and what study would you cite to tell us to go
Well,
read?
here's the study on the turnout of early voting. It's very simple. The guys who were, I'm trying to remember the guys at Reed College. That escapes me right now. Yeah, Gonke. Yeah, read his pieces. He was Gonke.
Paul Gronke.
Yeah, go to Pew, which not a traditional Republican group. Although it's kind of funny because it was the Sun Oil Company guys that founded it who couldn't be more conservative. But look at the Pew studies. The studies are pretty clear, and all these changes to make it easier to vote. Oh, and now correlation does not causation make, but as the laws have changed in this country to make it much easier to vote, more early voting, more mail voting, the rate of turnout. Now, maybe you can't always correlate and say results, but a lot of political science has gone into the early voting. And I can assure you, and I've spent a lot of time with people saying, oh, well, early voting's good for us or bad for us. This is like the old notion that somehow that absentee voting was good for Republicans. That's a constant notion that absentee voting is good for Republicans. Of course, the data doesn't really support that either. But it's one of those things that the consultants believe. And on the Democratic side, the consultants believe that early voting is good for Democrats. There just isn't any data that supports that.
That's
Quick
not
response. Okay.
Let me just say something. That is not entirely true. I think a more accurate statement would be that the research is mixed on the question of whether early voting can increase turnout. Some studies have found no result, as Mark says, but other studies have found an increase in turnout. And whether or not it benefits one party or the other, I think it may well depend on which party is more mobilized about early voting in that particular election. And let me also say, Paul Gronke was my co-editor, and I don't think he would endorse the characterization of his views. I think Paul's view would be the evidence is somewhat mixed on the relationship between early voting and turnout. Not that there is absolutely no effect on participation.
You don't need
Quick
to
point
depend
from
on it.
Marcia.
Just go to Pew, just Google Pew and Google early voting and read the study. That's better than the two of us.
Yeah, and an additional lens on the early voting question is if you look at the litigation, and in 2012, when Florida reduced its early voting and had a Section 5 review, and Section 5 was still in use, the court found that by Florida shortening early voting, it had a disproportionate impact on minority voters being able to participate.
Yep. And moderator's privilege. Early voting in combination with same-day registration definitely boosts turnout, sometimes by up to 10 to 12 percentage points. So adopt them together. Okay, sir.
Can I have one follow-up?
Okay, quickly.
Yeah, I just want to make sure, Mark, so you're not saying get rid of early voting, are you?
No,
And you're not saying never same-day registration, are you?
Here's my view on early voting is much more mixed. One, let me just say it was clear to me it doesn't have any partisan impact, nor do I think actually election day registration has much in the way of partisan impact.
Agreed.
With my partisan hat on, it doesn't make much difference. If you want me to do my political science worldview, is no, I'm actually not in favor of early voting, not because it has some partisan effect or it has any real effect. It's because you miss two things by early voting. One, you missed a campaign. You miss a big hunk of the campaign, which I actually, strangely enough, think is important. Two, you miss the civic experience that I think is very important to society of a joint activity that people go and vote on a day. I actually think that's quite important. I think that is a big thing for our society, this one day where people go to vote. I understand the need for for absentee voting for some people, but the notion that you would replace the system with this volunteers, with all this participation, our society doesn't need less civic participation.
Okay, the
Early
civic
voting goes there.
experience, that'll be the topic of a next panel. Okay, sir.
Two quick questions, one macro and one micro. On the macro level, is the panel saying that there is evidence and demonstrable evidence of a conspiracy, perhaps a national conspiracy, to interfere with people's voting rights in this election, as, for example, was alleged against the Bush administration in this century, the first election or second election of this century, that the Justice Department itself was being used to interfere with the election rather than to help it along. They vigorously denied it. But do we have any evidence here that the party, individuals, groups are conspiring to interfere with this election? And if so, is the Justice Department doing anything about it? Should we be doing anything about it? If not, who should be doing something about it? On the micro level, for those of us who are lawyers with time and energy to participate in the process from here on out, what is the most efficient way for us to help out in the regularity of this election?
Want to take that, Marcia?
Well, I'll start with the second question first. Please volunteer for election protection. We definitely need volunteers on the Lawyers Committee. We recruit legal volunteers. Common Cause is working to recruit other volunteers, but we definitely need a wide help, particularly since DOJ will not have the observers that they usually do, as Allegra mentioned in past elections. With regard to the question of a conspiracy, I am not aware of a conspiracy. I could just point to instances in particular jurisdictions where certain voters are targeted. And that's where we need to make sure that election officials are properly trained to ensure that that targeting does not keep eligible voters from being able to vote.
I would second both of those. The most important thing that people can do is to be a poll worker, although it's probably too late for you to do that now, and then second, be a poll watcher. And those are, and we've maligned them to some degree, but let's be totally candid. The vast, vast majority of both those groups of people are good, honest people trying to do their civic duty. All the sort of stories that we've heard of other things, those are small, tiny percentage. I know of no national conspiracy. I can assure you there's some local conspiracy of how do we elect Joe Smith to city council, or how Bob can be the mayor, or how we can do something about the gaming bill or something. Those are big ticket financial items, and people's desire to influence them in bad ways are real. But on national conspiracy, no.
So I would not use the word conspiracy either. When you use that word in an affirmative sense, it's like you should be fitted for your tinfoil hat, right? But I do think, and I don't think this is actually much of a conspiracy because it's not much of a secret, there are efforts by the dominant party sometimes to make it more difficult for members or those inclined to vote for the non-dominant party's candidates to vote. Sometimes this is done through voting rules, and this is what I worry about most in this space. Sometimes it may be done through voter intimidation by either subtly, usually more subtly, but sometimes more egregiously, as Marcia and Liz have documented, to make it more difficult for some groups of people to vote. And yes, I do think this is something that we should be concerned about. And let me just say one last point, tying together the points about race and partisanship. Making it more difficult for Democrats to vote and making it more difficult for racial minorities, particularly African Americans and Latinos, to vote, these goals are not mutually exclusive.
One last question.
Hi. Okay, so I have a short question and just some clarification regarding the early voting study earlier before. Was that any correlation made to maybe more disaggregated data in terms of different communities of color and how that affects those different communities of color? Because in at least research I have seen, there have been higher early voting. I think Marcia brought it up with communities of color. And then my larger question is around the poll workers and who actually designates what type of training that they receive. How is it ensured that they maintain the, I guess, the improper things to be done during that time? And what did you really mean by like improper assistance? Because other than one example, I didn't really get, I guess, the impact of that. And then kind of just going off of how we can continue to make the resources that are available to folks who are voting very clear at the polling site. So there is, whether it's a hotline or whether it's just having you have disability or language access and assistance at these.
Okay, that's a lot there, though. Thanks for that. But let's have this be a final round too. So maybe let's just go on down the line and you answer whatever part of that you'd like to. Or just your final thought too. Sure, Dan, let's start with you.
Well, I guess on the empirical point, look, I've got a long memo that I can find you if you want to email me with all the research on early voting and absentee voting laws and the relationship to turnout. Oh, sorry. I've got a long memo on this stuff. I'm happy to talk to you about this. But I guess the final point I'd say, so I actually was in a hurry to get my daughter to the bus today, and so I forgot my bag when I was getting on the plane, so I bought this, and all my notes are here. I've actually gotten through everything I wrote down over on the plane ride, but I will say this. I'm concerned about what the talk about election rigging might motivate in this election season. And, if I'm going to be completely honest, sometimes I have to say I've probably used this term, and I guess I'd urge all of us to be a bit more careful in our rhetoric about rigging and conspiracies, because while there are problems, a lot of problems in our voting system, and it is appropriate and indeed necessary for us to call attention to those problems where we exist, I do fear that if we start using this kind of hyperbolic rhetoric, collectively it starts to diminish the public's faith in democracy, and this is a real problem nowadays. So perhaps toning down the rhetoric a notch or two, at least when it comes to conspiracies or stolen elections or rigging, would be useful.
I both concur with that point, and then to the question about conspiracy. Conspiracy to commit voter intimidation is its own violates the federal law, its own federal crime. So, and I don't think, again, you could necessarily, substantiate that, although there are interesting quotes in this article about emails that were found in past elections, et cetera, not this article, this report. And there's a reason why we wrote the report Bullies at the Ballot Box, looking not just at, which is still on the Common Cause and the Demos website, looking not just at poll watcher, behavior itself, but then really, I think that it behooves all of us who are interested in what we could individually do between now and an election to help protect the right of every eligible American to vote, to be in touch with your local election officials, through election protection or just as a concerned citizen. There is, in fact, a website, obviously the election protection website, which is 866 Our Vote. And there's also a website, electionempowerment.org, if you wanted a set of questions to go through and, just contact your local election officials, ask them how they're going to go about training their poll workers, ask them if they are running fewer polling locations now that they did in 2012. That, for example, was the biggest problem that led to the huge long lines in Arizona in the primary this year. They just cut from like 60% of their polling locations. So those are some questions, and then you could file a report, and it will get back to some of the folks on this at the table about what you guys are finding. I think that some of the, a real problem that we haven't even really talked about is purging voters from the rolls. That is something that is going on, and that's the kind of
Got a lawsuit on that.
yeah, in Ohio.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. So there are a couple, but that's the kind of thing that there's a program called Interstate Crosscheck. There was just an article in Rolling Stone about a million names that have been flagged as potentially duplicate voters, but it's just first name, last name, and date of birth. As someone who is named Liz Kennedy, there are a lot of Liz Kennedys. I went to high school, college, and worked in my first law firm with one, right? So but they're not all that concerned about Liz Kennedys. They particularly are flagging like a Juan Rodriguez. So that we are really concerned about voters being removed from the rolls. You could call your local election officials and ask if that's happening. I think we need to think right now about the fact that most people are going to vote without a problem. But where there are problems, they may very well be targeted, and we just need to be the eyes and ears of protecting the voting rights of all eligible Americans so that we can be, the standard to which the wise and honest repair, right? We have a tradition of American democracy in our country. It's not perfect, but as they say about democracy, it's the worst except for all the others. Ours isn't perfect, but it's pretty good in the world, and we should be working to strengthen it and not squander the heritage of the peaceful transfer of power with these claims of election rigging and with these suggestions from advisors that there be widespread civil disobedience and a constitutional crisis, and the government will no longer be the government. So there are some that are fanning those flames, and I think, write an LTE, just as many voices as we can, defending and protecting our right to vote is really what we need to be doing now.
System works pretty good, doesn't work perfect. Most of the changes in the system to open it up.
Thanks to Dan. I'm sorry, just quickly, he has to run and catch
Hey,
a
Dan.
flight, so thanks so much, Dan Tokaji.
Back to Columbus. Most of the, I hate to be the cynic on the group, but most of the debate right now is pretty much partisanly charged, and I wouldn't pay much attention to it, to be candid with you. Most of the debate and a lot of the litigation is partisanly charged and is of modest reality. The problems with the system really are not principally voter intimidation, and they are not principally issues of access to the system. The system, it is much, much, much easier to vote now than it's ever been, and fewer people are not voting now. So the reason why we have fewer people not voting now has nothing to do with whether we have early voting or don't have early voting. We have some problems with the system. We're going to have increasing problems with the system with things like postal or mail voting. For every person who couldn't vote because of a voter ID dispute, 100 people didn't get voted, their vote didn't count either because of a postal problem or a problem that they filled out the form incorrectly, sending it back. Mail voting, if you want to know a system that disadvantages minority communities, look at the postal system of voting. Without a doubt, that disadvantages minority communities and communities which are less literate. So we have some concerns. Those are all concerns that nobody right now wants to talk about. We want to talk about these tangential issues, which in the end are tangential issues. What are big issues are states going to postal voting, which is a big problem. And even those people who don't think there's any vote fraud all acknowledge the fact that there's vote fraud in postal voting, and it's not unusual.
So I definitely agree that the rhetoric is deterring voters. The political rhetoric is deterring voters from being able to vote. We're moving into a presidential election that's not only the first in over 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. It's a presidential election that is occurring after a midterm where we had the lowest voter turnout in 72 years. And I think a lot of the challenges administratively to be able to vote is keeping voters away. And the best defense, I think, against potential voter intimidation for voters is education, being aware of what their rights are and what they need in order to be able to vote. One of the things that Election Protection is advocating this year is that voters put together a voting plan, confirm your registration, know where you need to vote, know what documentation you need to vote. So when you show up at the polls, if there's anyone that's trying to challenge you, you're prepared and able to vote. And lastly, I urge everyone here to volunteer for election protection. We need you, and with you there on the hotlines or at the polling place, we can help address some of these problems we've raised today.
Hear, hear. All right, many thanks to this wonderful panel, Liz Kennedy, Mark Braden, Marcia Johnson-Blanco. And get out and vote on November 8th or before if you have early voting in your state.